Hello, Bay Ridge. Welcome to another edition of After Hours. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about the account of Peter walking on the water. As I mentioned Sunday morning briefly in the teaching, the account of Jesus walking on the water is recorded in three of the Gospels. In Mark, as we were looking at it, but also in Matthew and in John. But only Matthew has the account of Peter walking on the water. It's not in Mark's Gospel. It's also not in John's Gospel. So why is that, is the first question. Why isn't it in all of the Gospels? And then secondly, what are we meant to learn from the account of Peter walking on the water? Well, the first question regarding why isn't it recorded in Mark and John's Gospel? The answer is not because it's not a historical event, that it really didn't happen, that neither Mark nor John were aware of this event, and Matthew made it up. Obviously, Mark is aware of the event. Peter is the one from whom Mark's gospel ultimately comes. But the reason for this is each gospel writer, as all historians do, only contain some of the events. The Apostle John even ends his gospel, at the end of his gospel, says, look, if I tried to write down everything Jesus had done, the whole world couldn't contain the books that would need to be written down. Each of them are giving only certain events and even certain aspect of events so that they can underline a particular truth. All history is done that way. That is not unique to the Gospels. That doesn't mean that they aren't history. All history is necessarily selective. It is not possible to write down everything that's going on. So each of the writers, as they are telling this event and this story, they tend to be focusing on one key aspect. In Matthew, the main thing that is really focused on is the walking on the water. So he doesn't even really mention all of the terms, as many of the terms as we went over in Mark's gospel today, and it's very distinct from what John is doing. John himself really only gives the barest facts and figures because he wants to focus on the discourse that happens with the multitude after they land. The majority of the chapter is taken up with that discourse, that Jesus is the bread of life, the great I am sayings that are there. And so he doesn't want to take the time to record Peter walking on the water because he's really trying to get to the discourse. Mark, however, as we saw today, is really revealing Jesus in his deity as the great I am, as the water walker, the passing by, saying I am, that God is the water walker in the Old Testament. So, of course, for either John or Mark to record it in their gospel, it would only disrupt the specific narrative that they are trying to get across, the particular purpose for why they are telling this story. It's also, I think, in Mark's gospel apparent because Peter rarely puts himself in a really good light in his gospel. And so Peter, being the one who's bold enough to get out of the boat and even for a short period of time walk on the water, would tend to put some focus on Peter and put him in a very positive light. And so he doesn't do that. And this is a reminder of why we read the gospels both individually to let them tell the story that they're telling, but also together. Because when we read it individually, we get all the emphases that Mark gives us, or that John gives us, or that Matthew gives us. We let it speak individually. But then we also read them together to understand that, well, Peter did actually do this, and there's a full picture of what's happening. So that's the first thing. Why wasn't it recorded there? Because it didn't fit the particular aspects of the event that they wanted to highlight. It would only disrupt the narrative and take away from the power and force of it. Secondly, what do we learn from it? Why did Peter walk on the water and what went on? Well, if you actually read the account in Matthew chapter 14, you read that Peter says, Jesus, if that's really you, call to me so I can come out of the boat and let me walk on the water. And Jesus says, it is. Why don't you come to me? And Peter gets out and he starts to walk upon the water. So first off is this amazing thing that through Jesus, Peter is able to do the miraculous. And that is a message to us as believers and to the church that Jesus, the water walker, the supreme one, can actually impart power to us, and he wants to do that. Secondly, we're told in the narrative that Peter is walking on the water, but then when he starts to look and he starts to notice the wind and the waves, he takes his focus off of Jesus and puts it on the storm around him. He immediately begins to sink. And that's a lesson for us as well. The focus needs to be on Jesus, not on the circumstances. When Christ is working, I remind you that the disciples were being obedient. Jesus had compelled them to get in the boat. He had sent them out into the storm. When they'd gone in the previous storm, they were there at Jesus's bidding. Walking with Jesus does not mean that we will not get into some really rough circumstances, that there won't be storms, so to speak. It does mean, however, that we have to put our focus on only one thing. Human eyes can really only focus on one thing, and everything else becomes blurry. And the problem was Peter put his focus on the wind and the waves, and Jesus became blurry. As long as he had his focus on Jesus, the wind and the waves were blurry. That's what true faith is what we are called to do, is to keep our focus on Jesus, not on the wind and the waves, so to speak. Because if we start to focus on the problems, the struggles, the issues, then we are going to sink. We're not going to be able to accomplish what God is calling us to do. Thirdly, when Peter sees them, he focuses on the wind and the waves, it causes fear. And when fear rises, faith sinks. We see this over and over and over again in the Gospels. This is yet another story that reinforces that. Faith and fear are opposites. They can't live with one another. And so the third thing we learn is that we are called to be people of faith, not people of fear. It doesn't matter what the storm is. If Jesus bids you come, you come. If he's telling you to do something, we do that thing, and we keep our eyes riveted on him, not on the circumstances around us. And then the fourth and final lesson is, notice Peter was able to do the miraculous, but Peter failed. He got his focus off of Jesus on the waves, and therefore he started living by fear rather than by faith. But the good news is, the fourth thing, Jesus immediately reaches out and he pulls Peter up. He doesn't say, oh, just go ahead and sink like a stone. I'm so disappointed in you. Even though Peter fails, Jesus saves him. And brothers and sisters, that in essence is the gospel. It's not about how much faith we've got or how great we are or whatever we do. You and I sink time and time again. But thanks be to God, Jesus never sinks. He never fails, and he never leaves us or forsakes us. Even when we are of little faith, even when we begin to sink like a stone, Jesus reaches out and he grabs a hold and he saves us. That's good news for you and for me. So I hope this is encouraging and helpful as you read the Gospels on your own, and to think through how we can learn reading them apart from one another, reading them together, and then learning from a specific incident like this one in Peter's life. I hope you have a great week, and I look forward to us gathering for worship again this Sunday. God bless.